So welcome to AHSS Presents, a conversation with Dr. Phoenix Alexander. My name is Sarah Brown. I'm a professor of English literature, and I'm also secretary of the Science Fiction Foundation. We're delighted to have Phoenix Alexander here with us today to talk about Curating the Future, the science fiction collections at the University of Liverpool, which I had the pleasure of visiting briefly a couple of years ago, and hope to do so again when things are more back to normal, hopefully. Please note that the session today will be recorded, but rest assured that as long as your cameras are off, you won't feature in the recording of the session. We'd really like to hear from you, your questions, any questions you might have for Phoenix. So do use the chat function and post your questions there. So after Phoenix's talk, there's going to be some Q&A, and I'll open with some questions of my own, but we'll definitely be picking up questions from all of you from the chat as well. So Phoenix, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for that introduction, Sarah. So, I am Phoenix Alexander. I'm the Science Fiction Collections Librarian at the University of Liverpool. I have a PowerPoint presentation that I'll show you all, and my presentation will take about 30 minutes. And I'm going to give a little overview of the science fiction collections at Liverpool, a bit about myself and my career trajectory and what I do as my day-to-day job. And then finally, just a little section about how to actually prepare oneself for work in this field, particularly if you're in higher education or otherwise. And I'm happy to answer questions about any aspect of that at the end. So without further ado, I will share my screen and you should see my PowerPoint slide. Okay, so welcome and thank you so much for coming. It's a pleasure to talk about the science fiction collections at the University of Liverpool. Now, my department is called Special Collections and Archives, and I think it's worth just sort of differentiating between the two, because it might seem obvious to some, but it isn't necessarily. So special collections are usually printed materials of unique or significant provenance. Now, unlike regular library materials that can be checked out and taken home and traveled with, special collections are usually kept within or accessed within a reading room. So you have to put a special request in, you have your item called up by a member of staff, and then you are able to look at those in a sort of controlled environment. And archives are usually associated with a particular writer or institution, and they can include materials of various kinds and formats, such as correspondence, manuscript drafts, typescripts, holographs, objects, photographs, and so on, video games, movies, etc. So these sort of a somewhat more eclectic collection, I might say, of materials, and they usually belong to an author, as I mentioned, who may have passed away or donated their materials. Liverpool is very lucky to have both unique special collections and archival materials. So that's just a little primer for folks who might not be familiar with the special collections and archives. So this is our hub. I'm going to throw some numbers at you quickly. Now, we do have the largest catalogue collection of science fiction in Europe. This encompasses both the University of Liverpool's own holdings and archival collections, as well as that of the Science Fiction Foundation, which I'll go on to introduce shortly. So we have over 35,000 books, 2,500 critical works, over 2,500 periodicals, as well as archives of some of the most notable figures in science fiction in the 20th and 21st centuries. You can see there John Wyndham, Olaf Stapledon, John Brunner, just to name a few. The Brian Aldiss archive that complements the collection at the Bodleian, Stephen Baxter papers. The list is pretty impressive. Now, I mentioned the Science Fiction Foundation. Sarah, forgive me, you already know this, and I'm sure some of you in the audience know of the foundation. But again, for those who are unfamiliar, the Science Fiction Foundation was founded in 1971, and it's one of the largest educational and research networks, I think the largest, sorry, in the UK. And we're very lucky to have its collections at the University of Liverpool. We steward them, we store them, and so on. I'll talk a bit more about that later, the kind of work we do. They publish Foundation, which is one of the foremost critical journals of science fiction. And our patrons are Neil Gaiman, as you can see pictured. This is actually my workplace down in the stacks in the sci-fi collections, and Naylor Hopkinson. And this is another picture of Neil Gaiman in our stores. And this is actually my predecessor, Andy Sawyer, who I'm sure many of you might know. He was at Liverpool for many, many years and did fantastic work. And yeah, this is a little bit more about us. Again, Foundation is a wonderful journal. And yeah, our patrons are listed there. And Naylor Hopkinson is actually a grandmaster of science fiction. So we're very, very lucky and fortunate to be able to steward these materials. As part of the collections, we also have, the Science Fiction Foundation's collections, I should say. We have a large holding of Terry Pratchett printed materials. Now, this includes works in translation in particular, as well as video games and other ephemera. And this is one of the, I guess, strengths, one of the many strengths of the collections. And again, later on, I'll talk a bit about the kinds of work we're doing with the Pratchett materials in particular. Now, I'm going to just give you, this was really hard selecting just a handful of items that sort of are my personal favorites or that are sort of notable among our holdings. And I tried to organize it so that it gives you a little snapshot into some sort of history of the genre. Again, I assume everyone attending is a science fiction fan or at least a genre fiction fan, but I know that's maybe not always the case. So I'm hoping to sort of give a bit of a sense of that history. But anyway, to this exciting and wonderful item on your screens, this is the first issue of Amazing Stories from April 1926. This was really the first mainstream publication of science fiction. It's a magazine periodical, I should say. And it was edited by Hugo Gernsback, of the Hugo Award. That's the award is named after him. And as you can see from the front cover, it has a pretty illustrious table of contents. You've got H.G. Wells, Jules Verne, Edgar Allan Poe, and we're very fortunate to have this issue in our holdings. And now this image you see here is a sort of a high quality digitized scan of the item. I've been using these to teach with online. Now, normally in non-pandemic times, students would be able to come in and actually handle this object. But even through a screen, I hope you can sort of appreciate the materiality of it through the folding of the paper and the cover and so on. And I'm actually going to show you the inside too. This is the full table of contents. Again, Wells, Edgar Allan Poe, Austin Hall, and other sort of big names of the genre. And what's most interesting, I find, with this particular item and periodicals of this kind is the introduction by the editor. Now you can see in the giant text here, Hugo Gernsback declares this to be a new sort of magazine. And you might notice a subtitle, the magazine of scientific fiction. So this was his attempt to combine the genres of the scientific romance along with, quite rigorous science and scientific innovation. And he coined this term to sort of inaugurate a new genre as he saw it. And it's largely considered to be one of, as I mentioned, the primary publication for science fiction as a genre, and sort of started off the whole shenanigans. We can talk a bit about the history of science fiction. My PhD actually pushed its genesis way back into the 18th century, but we don't have to go down that rabbit hole. But Amazing Stories, issue 1, April 1926, is a fantastic item in our collections. Now, this particular piece, I'll talk about this later, but I'll introduce its context later, but suffice it to say, we acquired the library of Arthur C. Clarke, who many of you might know, in December 2019, just before COVID. And this is a personal typewriter of Arthur C. Clarke. Now, when I opened the box and saw this for the first time. I'm not exaggerating. I really did get quite emotional. This is a Remington noiseless portable typewriter, so from around 1945. And it was on this typewriter that he typed an article for Wireless World magazine, which you can see here. And the article was titled Extraterrestrial Relays. And it was theorizing geostationary satellites for communication, the orbital heights and so on and so forth, velocities. And that technology didn't actually come about until, I believe, 1963. And here he was in 45, using his scientific background to actually give you the science of that, right? Of course, Clarke, as well as being one of the largest and most generous and exciting imaginations in the science fiction genre, was also a scientist. And this typewriter that you saw it's just incredible to think that he wrote this article on that. So that's another personal favorite and what I would call a highlight of our collections. And on the subject of Arthur C. Clarke, I've actually put together a website hosted by Omeka. There's the URL link there, and you can actually see many more items from his library for free in your own home, just by following that link. So, and there'll be a slide at the end with links for various things I'll mention in this talk. So if you can't skip back or you miss this, I can remind you at the end. Here's another item. This is from the Olaf Stapledon archives. Olaf Stapledon, again, you may be familiar with, another famous writer of the 20th century. He was actually a professor of philosophy at the University of Liverpool. And this item is really a delicate and beautiful piece. These are timescales or time charts that he hand drew for his novel Last and First Men. Now, anyone familiar with Stapledon's work will know that he is an author of what you might call future histories. He did the same thing in a slightly different context with Star Maker, his other sort of seminal work. And it might be a bit too small to see the details precisely, but with these charts, he theorizes a timeline, a sort of a past, present, and future for the human race that extends, I think, to the heat death of the universe and begins right at the beginning of time. And these are actually very delicate to see in person, that they're on very fine graph paper. You might be able to make out the grid, the faint grid in the background there. So we actually provide facsimiles for researchers to use. We don't actually allow access to the original. So I think this is a scan of the facsimile, but hopefully it still reproduces some of that detail. And if you look at his manuscripts too, and his notepads, there's such a meticulous script. It's very pleasing to see. And again, this is another personal favorite. And I'm going to sort of go on get on my soapbox about visiting archives and to better understand an author's work and an author's artistry. But I think it really helps you appreciate the sort of craft that goes into not just writing a book or writing a treatise or a paper, but really imagining it and bringing it to life. So again, this is one of my favorites. This is another first. I mentioned, I showed you the first issue of Amazing Stories. Interzone is, again, one of the biggest and most established UK-based science fiction magazines. And this is the very first issue from 1982. I mentioned the science fiction collections, obviously, Science Fiction Foundation collections. The Foundation have the archive of Interzone magazine that again, we store. And this is an amazing, amazing resource. And as you can see, again, from this editorial note here, it goes on to say, for 10 years or more, there's been a gap in British magazine publishing. We have lacked a popular magazine devoted to intelligent science fiction and fantasy, and to the other types of imaginative prose which lie on the borders of those genres. Again, these magazines are established to sort of make an intervention in the field of publishing in ways that they feel has been neglected or has not been carried out yet. And Interzone, if you don't read it, I would recommend it. It's a fabulous magazine. I think it's owned by TTA Press, along with Black Static, which is the horror side of things. They're fabulous. And again, their archive, it's a gift to us. And what I would mention here as well, I think it's interesting that the editor has cited other genres, other types of imaginative prose that lie on the borders of these genres. Now, obviously, my talk is titled The Science Fiction Collections at Liverpool, but as you might have surmised from what I've presented so far, we also have a large collection of fantasy and horror and other kinds of slipstream, you might say, texts. So, I mean, my personal perspective, and again, I can talk about this at length a bit later on, is that everything is speculative. I don't believe in realist fiction anymore. I think it's just various, I think it's various levels on a spectrum. And yeah, so I appreciate that these kinds of editorial notes make space for that kind of slippage between genres. And this is actually a really interesting zine. If anyone's familiar with zines, or I'm sure many people are familiar with zines. Zines are handmade, usually limited number, hand printed, basically magazines, pamphlets, usually created by fans as an informal platform to talk about what they like, what they dislike, about a particular text or author, and so on. And Femizine is a really interesting example of one of these texts, because it was founded in 1954 as a means to explicitly make room for women in science fiction fandom. It was supposedly edited by women, put together by women. The contributors were mostly women. And this is actually a still from a recent blog post on SCA's website that I wrote about the zine. Now, spoiler alert, I'm gonna tell you the giveaway here. It was fairly short-lived, this zine. It ran for 6 years, between 1954 and 1960. I think issue 9, it was revealed that the founder was actually a man, Sandy, whose surname I'm completely blank. Sandy was his nickname. And after a sort of tumultuous follow-up issue, it tried to change its name to Distaff, and then readers complained, so it changed back to Femizine. It was sort of taken over by a female editor, but it didn't last for very many issues after that. But again, this is just one. I mean, we have so many zines in the science fiction collections, and they represent such granular, I would say, insights into not just the history of science fiction in the 20th century, but really literary history. And there are so many to explore, and Femizine is just one notable example I decided to talk about and show you all today. And again, sort of plugging archives and special collections in general, I think that zines in particular offer a really democratic, if that's the right word, or renegade way of making sense of how authors are received, how texts are received, how literary traditions really are talked about, and how literary communities are made. And again, I would encourage everyone to make your own zines today, you know, even if it's a scrapbook or jottings in a notepad that you then stick clippings to. It seems quite old school, and obviously it's a fairly analog format. not thinking about e-zines and blogs and that kind of thing, which are their own kinds of course, community making. But there's something about the materiality, again, I'm going to go on about this, that I find particularly charming, which I guess is why I have the job I have. And yeah, so Femizine, again, just a good example of a key item in our collections. Now, a little bit about me. I'm not going to talk too much because I'm happy to answer questions later, but my trajectory was a fairly circuitous one. I initially trained as a fashion designer in London, switched to literature, much more noble field in my estimation. And I did my PhD at Yale University. And when I was there, I found the Beinecke Library, Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. And I thought, oh my goodness, you know, look at all these amazing texts. Look at all these, you know, special collections, materials that I had no familiarity with really up until then. And through years of work experience, working in the library as a curatorial assistant and experiencing a sort of wide range of tasks that make up librarianship, I decided that was the career I wanted to go down. This is the Beinecke, for anybody who hasn't seen it. It's a huge marble square in New Haven, Connecticut. It's really beautiful. And one of the most exciting projects I undertook there was processing and acquiring a collection of Samuel R. Delany. Again, Sam Delany, or Chip Delany, is one of the grandfathers, if you want to call him that, of modern science fiction. And I spent a really interesting day and a half, 2 days in a very hot storage facility in Philadelphia with him there and his assistant, going through 500 or so boxes of materials to collect, and then sort of whittle down to about 300, which were then taken back to Beinecke. And this is a picture of the materials unprocessed in their boxes still on the shelves in Beinecke stores. Now, I had the most enjoyable summer of my life, I'm not exaggerating here, sorting through all these boxes and arranging the materials for cataloging. And they went from this displays that you can see here to this. Now, this is just manna for a librarian seeing something like this. I organized them by titles from Delaney himself, going through to fiction, non-fiction, items with provenance. That is to say some kind of either annotation within the pages, or a signature at the beginning, or anything that marks an item as belonging to him explicitly, and then comics and graphic novels and other periodicals at the end. So this might seem a bit boring, and I'm sure it is to some people, but if you're this kind of person, you're interested in libraries and literary archives, this is fantastic, because not only are you making sure the materials are looked after, stored carefully, you're really honoring the work of the author who has donated them, or the figure who's donated them, as well as making them more accessible to researchers in the future, because that's ultimately what we want. We want people to use these materials, read them, be excited by them, find new insights in them, and this kind of work helps that. So I've talked a bit about this already, but I'll just whiz through some of the things that I've gotten up to in the almost 2 years I've been in this job, only 9 months of which were not in pandemic time. So it's been quite interesting, to say the least. Acquiring, as I mentioned, is a big part of it. So whether it's a library of a specific author, or whether it's looking at book dealer catalogs and finding interesting items to purchase that might shore up a particular an area that we might not have much about. This is I would say lesser part of my job at the minute, just because we just acquired 2 massive libraries. So as a librarian, I have to prioritize, okay, what do I want to grow in the collections, and how do I balance that with actually processing and cataloging what we have already. So this was actually a small selection of books, early 20th century science fiction from the George Locke collection. And this is the Arthur C. Clarke Library. And as you saw with the Delaney, it typically comes in the form of boxes in a storage facility. And it went from this, and we collected it, to this. So it's not fully processed yet, excuse me, but it is on the shelves in the sci-fi store. And I'm doing the same thing I did with the Delaney papers. So what you can see here are our texts by Clarke himself, to start with in the first section, and then they'll go on to be arranged in the various formats. Again, this might seem like slightly dull work, but to me it's incredibly exciting. So as well as acquiring and processing materials, I also teach. So I'm sort of a hybrid figure between an academic and a librarian. I teach on MA level courses, so using the Science Fiction Archive and Literature Science and Science Fiction. Using the Science Fiction Archive would, again, in non-pandemic times, be a hands-on practicum of not only how to handle special collections materials, but the kinds of questions to ask, and yeah, just the ways they can help your research. But during COVID, we had to deliver all this obviously online and remotely. So what you can see here is a little iPad stand and a laptop. So I would have the iPad above a material on a bookrest, showing how to handle it. And then to supplement this, I actually digitize a lot of materials for students to access on Canvas. So to still give a sense of the items, and to let them have a explore of a mini curated digital library. Outreach and engagement is a super fun part of what I do. So again, in non-pandemic times, organizing exhibits, pop-up exhibits, bringing in students and faculty for workshops. These are some postcards I had printed for a NASA commemorative event of the moon landings a couple of years ago. And these all feature images from our collections, as well as an Afrofuturism exhibit at the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool. And that was a little pop-up library, again, with a couple of postcards showcasing images from our holdings. And it was really exciting to actually talk to visitors about my own research, drawing on what I did for my PhD, as well as promote the collections and just show materials that people might not be familiar with, which is a huge part of the job and one that excites me very much. And finally, linking back to the Terry Pratchett holdings I mentioned earlier, the University of Liverpool is in a collaborative project with Senate House Library and Trinity College Dublin, who were the other two main repositories of Pratchett's materials. And it is a long-term project to digitize and do outreach with Pratchett's texts, his legacy, and his work. And it's great fun. This was actually a screenshot from the one in-person conference we managed to do again before COVID. And it was really great. I think Pratchett fan. I mean, it was for academic and the general public audiences, and Pratchett just has a way of bringing everyone in with his literature, and it was a great time. And I hope, as Sarah said, we can do these things again in person soon. I publish a bit, so again, not going to talk too much, it's fairly self-evident, but obviously I produce academic work about special collections and archives, but I'm also a fiction writer myself, and that's a very important part of what I do. It's a way of keeping in touch with the sci-fi community today, which is amazing, vibrant. There's so many publications online now, as well as the print magazines, and it's really enjoyable. It's another way of sort of expressing my love for the genre. And collection development. As a librarian, you have to decide your priorities. Do I grow the collections? Do I make stronger links with local authors? Am I going to collect in a particular time period? And how do we streamline the cataloging processes? How do we preserve materials that might be in obsolete formats, etc.? These are all kinds of administrative questions that it's not just me sort of theorizing all this by myself. I will collaborate with obviously the head of special collections and archivists to make sure that we have a plan to develop our holdings. And this is the one slide I had about this. I'm more than happy to talk about this in person if anybody has any questions in the Q&A. But how to prepare for a career in libraries and heritage fields. I approach this as someone who didn't necessarily know from a wee lad that this was a career path. I didn't know what that work entailed until I actually decided to go to grad school, and as I mentioned, went into the library, saw this whole other side of the work. So my narrative is very much going through the education route, I would say, and then discovering libraries. But I think wherever you work, if it's a museum, if it's a heritage kind of institution, make the most of people who are there, talk to colleagues, talk to fellow librarians or other librarians, sorry, or administrative staff, just to get a sense of what the work is like. Because I think so much of my work was kind of unknown to people, even within the same institution. And I realize this next point is a very privileged position to be able to do, but seek out as much work experience as you can, if you can. Typically, a lot of this is unpaid, which puts extra burden if you're trying to work at the same time, or obviously complete a degree of any kind. But even if you can just do 1 or 2 hours a week in a local archive or records office or something like that, again, just for yourself in a way to get a sense of, is this work that I enjoy? Could I see myself doing this? I think that really helps, and it's sort of a low stakes way of getting a taste for the work. And obviously, if you wanted to go down the route of a formal degree, there are American Library Association or CILIP accredited courses you can take in specific library fields. So like to be an archivist or a librarian. Again, different qualifications are required. And the last thing I'll say about this work is look at job ads carefully. A lot of the jobs I was applying for, they would say, have an ALA or CILIP accredited course or relevant experience. So my experience was, 4+ years working as a curatorial assistant, as well as my research qualifications as a PhD student. So you might not be excluded automatically from a job if you don't have a library degree. Obviously, it stands you in very, very good stead to do the work and get one. But there are many options, I guess. There are many routes into the field. And that's it for now. I think I'm going to stop. That was about half an hour. I hope that was enjoyable and made some kind of sense. And yeah, these are my details. Feel free to drop me a DM on Twitter or an email. That's my website if you want to check it out. And I will actually leave you with our library web pages too, so you can check out our holdings. The last thing I'd say, sorry, it's a common misconception in my experience that people think that you have to be affiliated with the university to research with our materials. That's not true. You just have to make an appointment and email special collections and archive staff, and we'll be happy to arrange a viewing. I think now, touch wood, we're just opening to external researchers. Hopefully, fingers crossed, everything continues to keep opening and stay opening. And we'd love to have you come see our stuff. So thank you very much for listening. I'll stop sharing my screen. And Sarah, I'll pass it over to you.
Oh, thank you. That was fascinating. And I loved seeing all those images. You've, in a sense, answered one of the questions I was going to ask, which was about your favorite items, but we've seen a wonderful array of varied items that obviously you love. And I really like that first magazine cover, the one with the sort of ships on the mountains. I hadn't seen that before. That was really striking.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to ask you a few questions, and I hope that I hope I'm seeing it correctly. I can't see any questions in the chat yet, but perhaps if I begin with a few questions, that will give people a chance to think of some questions to ask you as well. And I'd like to begin by just asking what sparked your own interest in science fiction originally. Was it watching something when you were young, or did it develop later?
I actually was more of a fantasy fan when I was young. I read a lot of David Gemmell, and I was hugely into tabletop games. I was a massive Warhammer 40k fan. I don't know if anybody plays out there. Out there, Tyranids. Love the Tyranids. But that was really my sci-fi love. I was just reading fantasy novels. In hindsight, I was reading a lot of stuff that I probably shouldn't have read at that young, because especially David Gemmell, it's pretty racy and pretty violent. I remember having some quite vivid dreams as a kid, which probably explains a lot. But funnily enough, as I aged into my 20s and 30s, it's flipped, whereas I don't really read fantasy that much anymore, and I would say I've really gone deep into science fiction. It's strange. I don't know why that's happened. I still enjoy fantasy, but I think I want there's something about the visual appeal of science fiction to me, the star fields, the nebulae, the starships, I just find wonderful. So it's kind of an answer to your question.
Yeah. And I was intrigued by, I think it was your own article title about women's archives. Was it Black Women's Archives? Because I was also going to ask you, but perhaps you could include that in your answer, about any favourite libraries in science fiction and fantasy you might have.
Sure. Do you mean fictional? Because I've sort of covered.
Yeah, sorry, fictional libraries. Okay,
I'll start with, well, I will mention probably Lauren Olamina from Octavia E. Butler's Parable of the Sower. It's not a physical library. Well, it's a physical library that the character is creating through the course of the two novels, but it's not fixed in a building. It's more of a sense of history making, history keeping, community making, record keeping. And it's sort of put together with books and journal entries. The novel is structured as, well, the first novel is structured as a series of her journal entries. And I think that fictional library to me does really, really important work. And I'm very influenced by something that the theorist Carla Peterson calls a home place. So it's ways that marginalized communities have theorized places of safety and of this kinds of history keeping and history making that preserves it from the vagaries of the external environment. And to pair that with a real life library or a real a physical collection, the Octavia E. Butler papers at the Huntington Library are just amazing, a fabulous resource. I mean, I've mentioned gift already. I don't want to overstate it, but Octavia E. Butler's archive is a gift. I mean, not only do you have the manuscripts, the short story drafts, etc., you have her journals from, spanning decades. You have cards, you have correspondence. You get such a strong sense of Butler as an archivist of her life. And it's something that I actually really encourage students to do. Um, the ways that the objects that we collect as we go through life can tell a story. The bus ticket for your trip to town, your to-do list for the day, your journal entry, if you write a journal, all these things together create such a vivid snapshot of your life in a very visceral and, again, as I mentioned, material way that I think we sort of take for granted or might do unconsciously without realizing it. And somebody like Butler really shows just the richness in those texts that you might not even think twice about. Now, she also plays some jokes. Sorry, this is going off the fictional library a bit, but I have to mention one of my favorite objects from her archive. I was digging through during my doctoral studies, and I found an envelope that said "The Secret of the Universe" or something. And I was like, "Oh wow, this is great! This is it! I'm gonna get the gift from Octavia E. Butler herself." And I opened this envelope, and it's a crisp packet folded up, and that's it. That's just it. And that was The Secret of the Universe. And I just thought, I was deflated, but then I also just had to laugh in the reading room because it was just such a funny thing. And that's one of many funny things that you'll find, not just in her archive, but in authors' archives in general. I mean, I think I think there was some teeth. Is it Ernest Hemingway's kids' teeth? I think I encountered once in Beinecke. I might be misremembering. I don't think I am. But anyhow, that's a long-winded answer to a question.
So I've never really considered how many objects other than papers and books might come into not just your library, but libraries generally which have special collections. Well, I do have some other questions I could ask, but I think because there are lots of questions coming into the chat now, I feel I should turn to those. So I will pick out, and I apologize if I won't be able to cover everything, but perhaps I could open with a question from Sue, which is, do you have anything in your archive dating back to the 1800s? I guess that could be 18th or 19th century.
Yes. In the science fiction collections, I think so. I think we have novels or novelettes from the 19th century. I would say that the older objects are in special collections writ large and not the science fiction collections in particular. But ironically enough, that is actually an area that I do want to collect more of in the future. So with the George Locke, for instance, that was early 20th century. I would say that the majority of the materials are from the 20th century or late 19th century at least. And at least as I've encountered, we don't have too many texts from before then. But that's a great question.
And another question about the collection, which is, sorry, no, not about the collection, but a question picking up on something you were talking about, one of the pictures of the zine, which is, do you have any recommendations for an introductory work on zines and zine culture?
Oh, yes, there are. It's a website, I believe, and now I think it's there are two. Sorry, I think it's SF Zines, and there's Queer Zine Library. But I would say the first port of call would be ISFDB, the Internet Speculative Fiction Database. I think it's isfdb.com. Now, if you go on there, you can find, and if you type in zine in the search engine, in the search box, you'll be able to find sort of breakdown of many of the sort of seminal titles, and also oh gosh, the online encyclopedia of science fiction. If you check that, I mean, that's a fantastic resource. So again, if you search zine in there, it will give you what you want to find. It'll give you an introduction to SF zines, and as well as specific titles. So not a book, but web resources, and I can type those in the chat if that's easier, or circulate them after somehow.
I'd just like to echo that recommendation of this online science fiction encyclopedia. It's just an amazing resource. I'm always so impressed by how much comprehensive information about so many topics they've got there. So going back to the questions, does any of your collection, this is a question from Julie, cover speculative fiction and science fiction from Africa or Asia?
Not enough, sadly. Not enough is the honest answer. Most of our holdings are from UK-based authors and predominantly white authors. And it's something that I'm really keen to develop our collections in. You know, Liverpool has one of the oldest Chinese communities in Europe, for instance. I would love to collect, you know, texts. I mean, that sounds problematic framing it that way, but to represent texts from those communities. And funnily enough, some of the feedback from the Afrofuturism exhibit that I did at the Slavery Museum was that it was quite US focused, with all Afro-Caribbean, like Korean authors based in the US. And again, that's something that I want to develop our collections in and make my own links. You know, being out of the country for 6 years, it was a tricky adjustment period in that I think part of the work of a librarian is to not just seek out texts or but actually to go out into the community and go out into the city and to really kind of build trust and build rapport and collaboration between different institutions and communities. So that's, again, a long answer to the question, which is to say, no, we don't have a lot of texts from Africa, the African diaspora, in our holdings, but it's something that I certainly would like to develop in the future. But thank you for that question. It's a very important point.
And going back to one of the first questions to go up, which is a bit more precise, so it could be quite tricky, but I think it is a fascinating question, which is from Ayal. And he writes, if I'm looking for a proof for an inspiration of an author by another author, would I be able to find something like that in the archives?
Yes. Do you mean...
I think proof that say author A read author B, something like that.
Yeah, oh, definitely. Frequently, editors, authors will be in conversation with one another. There's a really great letter from Virginia Woolf to Olaf Stapledon. And she makes this funny comment that she says something like, it's sort of a backhanded compliment. She says, oh, I really like your writing. I don't really understand it, but it's great. You know, it's cute. Good job. That's not verbatim, but that's the sentiment. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's part of, again, the fun of looking in, looking in the collections. And actually, while we're on this topic, you can actually do that research online. So if you, I think I've put the link to the archive finding aid. We have a robust finding aid for the archival collections in the library. And what you can actually do is go through each of the folders, and each item has a fairly detailed description. So for instance, you could do John Wyndham Archives, drop down correspondence, drop down A to Z by, you know, contact. And then each individual letter will have an item description, and that description will say, you know, letter from Virginia Woolf to so-and-so talking about the weather, or letter from this other author talking about their upcoming book, or, you know, their forthcoming book. So you can actually do a lot of that investigative work, again, on your laptop or in any computer on your phone, which is great. And you can find those proofs, as you mentioned.
I'd never thought of connecting Olaf Stapledon and Virginia Woolf together. So that was a very interesting detail. And I suppose another just very simple way in which one can work these questions out that AR was asking was by looking at what books an author owned, and you could just see what's in their library.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
There are a couple of questions which are about, I suppose, new technology and how things might change in the future. So I'll move on to one of those. Danny's asking, apart from the obvious move to IT, have you noticed any general trends in how authors write science fiction over the past century. So I guess that's about how things have changed, what shifts have been. That's another huge question. But
yeah, I think one of the interesting things that I've seen is that frequently a lot of science fiction, fantasy, horror authors are writing across different formats, particularly games. Game writing is huge, I think, or is becoming huge. So you can see in the Clark library, for instance, there's these really amazing janky giant CD-ROM game boxes of Clark's Rama, and it's written by Clark. He did the script, and you see a digital version of him on the back. It's fantastic. And the same with the Terry Pratchett. There's a couple of Terry Pratchett Discworld games, but a lot of writers now are either doing scripts for video games, or they're using platforms like Fine to do sort of choose your own adventure type. I forget the term, like kind of modular narrative, where it uses simple coding to basically chart a unique narrative experience for readers, or they become more than readers. You're sort of interacting with the text. And just on a formal note, I would say science fiction short forms are becoming more experimental. So Sarah Gailey's Step, for instance, is a really fabulous story put together in the format of a edited journal article, basically, with the editor's comments and her comments telling a really, really compelling narrative. And we've seen that with in a novel form too, with something like Rian Hughes's XX. If anybody's familiar with that, it's a huge giant novel that's sort of messing about with typography and formatting, and it is actually staging that debate of 19th, 20th, and 21st century forms. So those are some of the ways I think that the field is changing. And I don't know if you mean the library field too, but we're certainly not only looking to digitize a lot of our collections and host them on online platforms. We're looking at how to archive something like Samuel Delaney's Facebook messages. Not at Liverpool, obviously Beinecke has those, or has Chip's library, but how does one archive a Facebook post? How does one encompass that within an author's archive in a library? So these are questions that the library field, I think, is dealing with today. But that might be beyond the purview of the question. So apologies if it was.
Well, that actually in part answers, I think, Gabriella's question, which was about whether there's a particular interest in digitizing the collections as a means to creating virtual archives. So clearly that's happening.
Yeah, and I think the pandemic has really accelerated that trend, because accessibility is a huge part of what we do. And as I mentioned earlier, we want people to be able to research and access and read these materials. And I think doing so much remote teaching or remote presentations like this one really underscores the importance of having these digital tools to do that.
There's one intriguing question here about mapping future dates. I'll just read it out, but it's from Alex. It says, as we're now overlapping early science fiction future dates, have you ever thought of mapping the events or the inventions that should happen next year? So that sounds like an exhibition project almost.
I mean, that's a great idea. Yeah. So funnily enough, there's an Arthur C. Clarke text that has its own timelines at the back of, I think it goes about 100 years into the future, so like 2100, 2200, and it actually theorizes which technological innovations will have become a reality by then. That we don't have plans at the minute, but I think that's a great idea, because so many texts. It's interesting that some things age better than others, of course, but no, fascinating. But that text, the question reminded me of those charts of Clarke in particular. Now, I think he's spot on with some things and prescient in some things, but other things I don't think we're quite there yet. I think he was predicting wide-scale genetic manipulation by around 2020, which obviously is a bit dodge right now. And it's not really happening.
Whereas he tends to, I think, be a bit conservative about where he imagines, for example, the position of women in society, by contrast with this overambitious projection of the future of technology and science. I just say that because I teach Childhood's End and was aware of that in the book. I think I've brought out most of the questions in the chat. Maybe I'll just end with a couple of the other questions that I'd hoped to ask you myself. And first was just to ask whether anything in the collections was likely to be inspiring your own future research, or maybe your own future works of fiction. Is this something that you've been working on yourself?
Yes. So I would say, I mean, shameless plug, I have a book chapter coming out next year on, it's for a book project called Queer Print Culture. So I'm looking at Femizine as well as other zines in our collections in the ways that they try and reform or rehabilitate sexuality in sci-fi fandom, which, like any literary history, has been quite toxic historically to some folks in the past. And actually, to your last comment, there's a really funny cartoon in one of the Femizine issues of a alien, a UFO ship landing, and the little green men come out, and there's two women standing in front of them, and one of the aliens says, watch out, this is really weird, could be dangerous. Sort of literalize, oh my god, it's a femme fan, it's a woman fan. And there's a really funny response in Femizine too. I forget what it's responding to. I have it on my desk at work, but it's been a couple of weeks since I've been in. But it talks about the 5 different types of female fan, right? And it's very pejorative, it's not flattering. But this Femizine response is really a witty takedown, inspiring my own work. Yeah, I mean, just being around the material, like just being around the Hugo Awards and being around the typewriter, seeing the, and I as I mentioned, I've only been in the job 2 years. Most of that's been working remotely in lockdown. So I feel like I've only scratched the surface of really exploring all the periodicals and zines in particular, but just seeing in some ways how small the communities are, and everyone's reading everyone's, editing everyone, anthologizing everyone, and it's really inspiring, and it's something that I'm hoping to model, trying to model in my own writing career now. And I remember, a bit of a humble brag, but when I was doing the Delaney stuff, he handed me, we took a photo of his his Grandmaster Awards and his Hugo Award. It was wild. It was like a jewelry store. I didn't include the picture because I thought that would be a bit too douchey. But I remember vividly, he said to me, he was like, "Oh, you could win one of these one day." And I was just like, "Oh." And it sounds really tacky and really cheesy, but it's just, again, the materiality of like, oh my gosh, this is what it looks like. Because you can idealize people and idealize things so much. And then when you see the physicality of like, this is an author's life work, like this is an author's library. These things are built a book at a time, a story at a time, a letter at a time. And I just find it an incredibly inspiring environment in general, in every aspect of what I do.
And still, perhaps just one final question on the library, which is inspired by the fact that the Science Fiction Foundation, which is the sort of body which owns, is that the right legal term, owns one of the main science fiction collection at Liverpool, was founded 50 years ago. And I wondered what you would like to see the collection being like in 50 years time.
Yeah, and a great question. I mean, as apart from the obvious, continuing to grow and represent British science fiction in all its diversity and all its creativity, something that I wanted to do coming into the job, coming from the US, having the 6 years abroad in the US and in the US library field, but also the US based sci-fi field, is to really sort of broadcast the scope of the foundation collection to an international level. I mean, it already is there, but to really explicitly build connections and collaborations with institutions. So one of the things I'm part of, or the Liverpool is part of now, is the Science Fiction Collections Libraries Consortium, SFCLC. It's a bit of a mouthful. And this is a consortium of, I think there's around 30 members of basically libraries that have significant science fiction holdings. And we have monthly meetings where we collaborate, we discuss what's going on in our institutions, ways of teaching remotely, for instance. And we're actually organizing a lecture series called Mirror Talks, which is happening this year. The first one is next month, I believe. And just ways that, you know, we can share digitized items to exhibit in online exhibits, you know, again, cross-pollinating the institutions. And it's just another way of making our collections more accessible. So I think continuing to be a mouthpiece for, you know, hey, it's become a bit of a cliche. Whenever my colleagues in the office hear me saying this, they sort of roll their eyes, but, you know, we are the largest catalog collection of science fiction in Europe, thanks to the Foundation's collections. And, you know, we are in a sort of international consortium of some of the major and most significant, you know, literary repositories in the world. And just continuing to amplify that and really build on that and all the exciting work that makes possible.
Great. I just want to apologize for having overlooked some of the later questions in the chat. Perhaps we could just really quickly pick up on a couple of them. So just before we go finally, are there any plans to celebrate the centenary of Amazing Stories in 5 years? And does the library do much to support up and coming authors? And there are a couple of other questions, but because I think actually it might be good for, say, someone who's interested in visiting the collection to contact you directly, Phoenix, about that. And I'm sure it would be once lockdowns earlier. But yeah, so any plans to celebrate Amazing Stories? And on a more recent note, of the centenary of Amazing Stories, and what does the library do to support up and coming authors, if anything in particular?
Yeah, great questions. So to answer the first, no, I don't think there's any plans at the minute, but again, that's a fantastic idea. And I think we've been programming, and we've been involved in exhibits like the AI exhibit that's happening. That's the World Museum is hosting, I think opening in May or June, but purely logistically, we haven't really been able to plan an awful lot, given that we haven't been able to be physically in the library. But that's certainly a good idea to think about. And yeah, it could be a really fantastic way of, again, showcasing items like the first issue, as well as other issues. And we actually have a really great, another favorite item in the collection is this giant calendar of Frank May illustrations. I mean, he did a lot of the cover illustrations for Amazing Stories, and they're just incredible. And they're always, it's an item that people really respond well to, because I think so much of science fiction, as I mentioned when I was talking about my own attachment to it, is the visual impact and the visual appeal of science fiction. So yeah, certainly great idea, and it's something that we'll definitely think about. And the second question was, what do we do to support local authors, up and coming authors? Well, we've actually, one of the things I've been trying to do is partner more with industry, like the creative publications, magazines. And we've formed a recent partnership with Heroic Books, who are based in Liverpool, to do author events. So again, online conversations. We're trying to get work placements for students to, not work placements, sorry, work experience for students to review and maybe interview up and coming authors or new and local authors in particular, as much as we can during pandemic. But what's been good is that students can still create video content for YouTube or Twitter, you know, blog posts, and really just contribute to the larger ecosystem of science fiction. But going forward, I would love to have authors, you know, maybe book launches in the reading room, or, you know, readings and workshops with students. That's something that I'm really excited to program more of. Again, when we can, hopefully, touch wood, be able to start thinking about these things in meet space.
Indeed. Well, thank you again, Phoenix, and apologies for, I think I've covered nearly all, but probably not quite all of the very interesting questions in the chat. But I'd just like once again to thank Phoenix Alexander for his really inspiring and fascinating talk. And I think it will have given people ideas not just about science fiction, but also about different kinds of careers, which are adjacent to, but not absolutely within academia. So I think that's been hugely helpful. Thank you very much.
Oh, no problem. Thank you. And if anybody wants to email or reach out to me, with via any platform, Twitter, email, whatever, I'm always happy to answer questions and have a chat.
And thank you to everyone for coming and for your questions.